I started sleeping with the television murmuring in the corner, its blue glow a barrier against the dark. Neither helped. The bed incident began 3 weeks after I moved in. I woke to the sensation of weight settling onto the mattress beside me. A distinct depression, the kind made by a body lowering itself slowly, carefully, as if trying not to disturb. I was facing the wall, frozen, every muscle locked rigid. I felt the warmth of proximity without contact, the way you can sense another person's presence even with your eyes closed. And then, crying. Soft, broken sobs, muffled as if by hands pressed over a mouth. A woman's grief, raw and shapeless, pouring out inches from my ear. Between the sobs, words emerged, whispered, barely audible, thick with terror. He's still here. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The crying continued for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, the mattress dipping and shifting with the weight of sorrow I couldn't see. When it finally stopped, the weight lifted slowly, and I heard, or felt, something move toward the bedroom door. I didn't turn over until morning. When I did, the sheets on the other side of the bed were twisted, bunched, disturbed in exactly the way they would be if someone had been lying there. I called my sister. I told her about the noises, the voices, the weight on the bed. She listened with the patient concern of someone who had watched me spiral through my divorce, who knew the texture of my particular brand of anxiety. "Have you been sleeping?" she asked. "Eating? Taking care of yourself?" Her questions carried an implication I didn't want to examine. My own mental history wasn't exactly spotless. There had been the depressive episode after my marriage ended, the months of therapy, the careful reconstruction of a self that had fractured along familiar fault lines. I knew what she was really asking. I knew she was wondering if this was a relapse. The worst part was, I wondered too. I started documenting everything. I bought a notebook and recorded each incident with clinical precision. The date, the time, the exact nature of the disturbance. The footsteps that paced the upstairs hallway every night at 3 a.m. The whispered arguments that bled through the walls. The dishes I found rearranged in the morning. Not broken, never broken, but moved, shifted, placed in patterns I hadn't created. The cold spots that appeared without explanation. Concentrated patches of frigid air that seemed to follow me from room to room. Reading the entries back, I saw how it looked. I saw the portrait they painted of a man losing his grip, conjuring phantoms from stress and isolation. The handwriting grew more erratic as the weeks progressed, the descriptions more desperate. But the documentation also revealed something else. Patterns. The voices always argued about the same things. Money, trust, another woman's name I could never quite catch. The weight on the bed always appeared between 2 and 4 a.m. The footsteps always stopped at the same point in the hallway, just outside the door to the empty room I still couldn't bring myself to furnish. I began to feel that I was observing something rather than experiencing it. That these disturbances weren't meant for me at all. I was an audience to a tragedy that had already happened, watching scenes play out on a loop, bleeding through whatever membrane separates then from now. The neighbor found me sitting on my front steps at 6 a.m., wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. I hadn't slept in 2 days. The weight on the bed had come every night, heavier each time, the crying more desperate, the whispered warnings more urgent. He's still here. He's still here. He's still here. The neighbor was an older woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed. She brought me tea in a ceramic mug and sat beside me without asking permission. "You've seen her," she said. Not a question. My hands shook as I raised the mug to my lips. I didn't answer. "The previous owner," she continued, watching my face carefully. "Him and his wife. They fought constantly. The whole neighborhood heard. She was afraid of him. Anyone could see that. And then one day, she just wasn't there anymore. He said she left, packed her things in the middle of the night and disappeared. The tea had gone cold. I hadn't taken a single sip. No one believed him," the neighbor continued softly. "We all thought, well, you hear stories about the things that happen behind closed doors, about the secrets houses keep, She looked at me then with something between pity and warning. He sold the house cheap because he couldn't stand to be in it anymore. Said he kept hearing her, kept feeling her at night, sitting beside him, crying. Said she wouldn't stop telling him that he was still there. My throat closed around words I couldn't form. The neighbor's eyes held mine. "The question is," she said, "who do you think she's warning?" I'm writing this from the living room. It's 3 a.m. And the footsteps have started again, pacing, pacing the hallway above my head. The weight came earlier tonight, heavier than ever, the crying so close to my ear I could feel breath that wasn't there. The whisper has changed. The words have shifted. He's still here. He knows you can hear me. He knows you're listening. I've stopped trying to determine what's real. The boundary between haunting and psychosis has become meaningless. Either I'm sharing this house with echoes of something terrible, or I'm fragmenting in ways I can't control. And both possibilities lead to the same dark corridor. The neighbor's question haunts me more than any phantom. Who is she warning about? Is she speaking to whoever lives here? Whoever occupies this space that holds her like an insect in amber? Or is she speaking about whoever lives here? Is the presence she fears the previous owner imprinted on these walls like a bruise that won't fade? Or is it something else entirely? Something that was here before him, before any of them. Something that draws certain people to this house with its impossible price and its bad memories. I catch myself in mirrors now, staring, searching my own reflection for signs of something other. I've started to lose time, minutes here, an hour there. Gaps in my documentation where I don't remember what I was doing or where I was standing. Sometimes I wake on the stairs with no memory of leaving my bed. Sometimes I find my hands doing things without my permission. Opening doors, closing windows, arranging dishes in patterns that feel familiar, even though I've never learned them. The footsteps have stopped. The house has gone silent in that terrible, watching way. I just heard something in the hallway outside this room. A whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to understand. He's still here. And for the first time, I'm not certain which of us she means. Story 2. The smell hit me first, something between mildew and burnt sugar, a sweetness that clung to the back of my throat like a warning I chose to ignore. The apartment was small, barely 600 square feet of warped hardwood floors and walls that seemed to breathe when the radiator coughed to life. But the rent was impossibly low, almost offensively so, and I had learned long ago not to question good fortune when my bank account hovered perpetually near zero. The real estate agent moved through the space with the hurried efficiency of someone eager to complete an unpleasant task. He spoke quickly about the building's history, constructed in 1923, renovated twice, most recently in the 80s, while his eyes avoided mine with practiced precision. When I asked about the previous tenants, he paused at the window, his reflection ghostly against the gray afternoon light. "They left without notice," he said. "It happens sometimes. I should have pressed him. I should have asked why the rent was half the market rate, why the hallway lights flickered in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, why the building superintendent refused to meet my eyes when I passed him in the lobby. Instead, I signed the temporary lease and accepted the keys, their cold weight settling into my palm like a premonition. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked my meager belongings, arranged furniture that seemed to shrink against the apartment's cramped dimensions, and tried to convince myself that the persistent chill was merely poor insulation. The radiator worked in erratic bursts, filling the rooms with waves of dry heat that never quite penetrated the cold spots near the corners. At night, I would wake to the sound of settling pipes, the groaning of old wood, the distant murmur of traffic 7 floors below. Normal sounds, the sounds of any old building adjusting to a new occupant. It was on the 8th day that I discovered the first message. I had been repainting the bedroom wall. The previous color, a sickly yellow that reminded me of jaundiced skin, had begun to flake near the baseboard. As I scraped away the loose paint, My tool caught on something uneven beneath the surface. Letters emerged from under the yellow, carved into the plaster with what must have been a fingernail or the edge of a key, the marks deep enough to survive multiple coats of paint. Don't sign the final contract. I stood there for a long moment, the scraper trembling slightly in my hand. The logical part of my mind constructed reasonable explanations. A disgruntled former tenant, a joke, perhaps even my own imagination transforming random scratches into meaningful shapes. But my fingers traced the letters anyway, feeling their deliberate curves, the urgency embedded in each stroke. I painted over the message that evening. The fresh white coat covered it completely, though I found myself avoiding that section of wall, positioning my bed so I wouldn't have to face it while I slept. The second message appeared 3 days later, in the bathroom. I had been scrubbing the tile grout, a task I'd been avoiding since move-in, when I noticed discoloration behind the medicine cabinet. The cabinet came away from the wall with surprising ease, revealing a patch of exposed plaster covered in the same desperate handwriting. He only appears after the third rent. My second rent payment had processed 2 days prior. I had 19 days until the third. I began to research the building's history with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The public records revealed little. Construction permits, ownership transfers, the usual bureaucratic documentation of a century-old structure. No deaths were recorded within its walls, no scandals, no unexplained disappearances. The building existed in a kind of historical vacuum, unremarkable in every measurable way. And yet, I started noticing things, small inconsistencies that accumulated like dust in the corners of my perception. The elevator, when it worked, would sometimes stop between floors for exactly 3 seconds before continuing. Always 3, never more, never less. The hallway outside my door contained 14 overhead lights, but I could only ever count 13 when I walked its length, no matter how carefully I tracked each fixture. The building superintendent, a heavy-set man with hands like weathered leather, would appear in the lobby at precise intervals throughout the day, always facing the same direction, always wearing the same expression of patient anticipation. I told myself I was being paranoid. Stress from the move, perhaps, or the isolation of living alone in a new city. I called my sister. She lived 3 states away and worried about me constantly, and listened to her voice without really hearing her words. She asked if I was sleeping well. I told her yes, because the alternative would have required explanations I couldn't provide. The footsteps began on the 15th day. At first they were barely audible, a soft rhythm in the hallway outside my door, the kind of sound that could easily be dismissed as a neighbor returning home late. But they continued past my apartment, then returned, then passed again, establishing a pattern that repeated throughout the night. Back and forth, the measured tread of someone pacing with purpose. I opened my door once, around 3 in the morning, and found the hallway empty. The footsteps had stopped the instant my hand touched the doorknob. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, pregnant with a presence I could feel, but not see. I stood in my doorway for what felt like hours, staring at the flickering lights, counting them over and over. 13. Always 13. I stopped sleeping properly after that. The footsteps came every night now, growing bolder, coming closer. Sometimes they would pause directly outside my door, and I would lie rigid in my bed, barely breathing, waiting for the knock that never came. The temperature in the apartment dropped, despite the radiator's constant groaning, and I began wearing layers even indoors, my breath occasionally visible in the cold air near the corners. My co-workers noticed the change. My supervisor asked if everything was all right at home, her concern genuine but distant, the polite worry of someone who didn't really want to know the answer. I assured her I was fine, just adjusting to the new place, and she accepted the explanation with visible relief. I had become skilled at constructing normalcy from fragments of pretense. The third rent payment was due in 4 days when I found the final message. I hadn't been looking for it. I had, in fact, been trying very hard not to look at the walls at all, to move through my apartment with my eyes fixed on safe spaces, the floor, the ceiling, the window that faced nothing but gray sky. But the corner of the living room had begun to bulge slightly. the wallpaper separating from the plaster beneath, and some compulsion I couldn't name drew me toward it. The paper peeled away easily, too easily, as if it had been waiting for my touch. Behind it, covering nearly the entire corner from floor to ceiling, words crowded together in frantic clusters, the handwriting increasingly erratic as it climbed higher. Names, dozens of them, written in different hands, different styles, spanning what must have been decades. Beneath each name, a date. Beneath each date, the same two words repeated like a litany. Still here. I don't remember falling. I came back to myself on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold hardwood, staring at the baseboard where more words had been scratched into the wood itself, smaller than the others, almost invisible unless you knew to look. We never left. The footsteps in the hallway had stopped. In the silence, I became aware of another sound, breathing, soft and patient, coming from somewhere behind me. I couldn't turn my head. My body had become a foreign thing, unresponsive to my increasingly frantic commands. I lay there, listening to that measured respiration, feeling the temperature drop around me degree by degree. When I finally managed to move, hours or minutes later, the apartment was empty. The wallpaper had reattached itself to the corner, smooth and undisturbed as if I had never touched it. I scrambled to my feet and tore at the paper, searching for the names, the dates, the evidence of what I had seen. The wall beneath was blank, fresh plaster, unmarked and white, and I called my landlord the next morning. The woman who answered spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone managing too many properties, too many tenants, too many complaints. I asked about the previous occupants, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. She consulted her records and told me the apartment had been vacant for 3 years before I moved in. That's impossible, I said. Someone was here. Someone left messages. She assured me I was the first tenant since the last renovation. The previous occupant had simply stopped paying rent and disappeared, leaving no forwarding address, no explanation, nothing but an empty apartment and an expired lease. I asked about the occupant before that. She put me on hold. When she returned, her voice had changed, becoming careful and measured in a way that made my skin crawl. Our records don't go back that far, she said. Is there anything else I can help you with? I have 2 days until my third rent payment. The footsteps have stopped completely now, replaced by something worse. A silence so complete it feels like pressure against my eardrums, like the building itself is holding its breath. I find myself avoiding the corners of my apartment, those cold spots where the temperature drops and the shadows seem to gather with purpose. Last night, I woke to find my bedroom door open, though I distinctly remember locking it before bed. The hallway beyond was dark, darker than it should have been with the emergency lighting that usually glowed green near the stairwell. I lay in bed and watched that darkness, waiting for something to emerge from it, certain that at any moment I would see movement, a shape, a face. Nothing came. Nothing ever comes. That's the worst part. The anticipation without resolution, the fear without confirmation. I am beginning to wonder if the messages were ever real, if the names on the wall were anything more than shadows cast by my deteriorating mind. The superintendent smiled at me this morning, a knowing expression that might have been friendly, or might have been something else entirely, and I couldn't bring myself to smile back. I've drafted an email to my landlord requesting to break my lease. It sits in my outbox, unsent, while I debate whether I'm overreacting, whether I'm allowing fear to dictate decisions I'll regret. The apartment is so cheap. The location is so convenient. Everything about this situation can be explained rationally if I'm willing to make the necessary assumptions about my own mental state. The final contract sits on my kitchen counter, delivered yesterday by a courier who wouldn't meet my eyes. All it requires is my signature and the third rent payment, and the apartment will be mine for another year. I pick up the pen sometimes, in weak moments, telling myself that signing is the reasonable choice, that the alternative, admitting something is wrong, facing the possibility that I've imagined everything, is worse than whatever might be waiting. The footsteps have started again as I write this, but they're not in the hallway anymore. They're inside the walls. I can hear them moving through the building's bones, tracing paths between the apartments, circling closer with each pass. Sometimes they stop directly behind me, separated from my back by mere inches of plaster, and I feel what might be breath against the nape of my neck, cold and patient and impossibly close. Tomorrow is the third rent payment. I haven't decided yet whether I'll make it, but I've noticed something strange about my reflection in the bathroom mirror, a hesitation in its movements, a fraction of a second where it doesn't quite match my own. I've started avoiding mirrors entirely, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor when I brush my teeth, refusing to look at any reflective surface after dark, because I'm no longer certain the face looking back is mine. And somewhere, in the walls, in the corners, in the cold spaces where the light doesn't reach, someone is waiting. Someone who has always been here. Someone who remembers every tenant who came before me, every name scratched desperately into plaster, every warning that went unheeded. The contract is still unsigned, the pen is still in my hand, and the breathing behind me has grown louder. Story 3. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper with character. What she meant was that the house sat at the end of a dirt road so neglected that my sedan scraped its undercarriage twice before I reached the property. What she meant was that the nearest neighbor lived a quarter-mile away, and the silence out here pressed against your eardrums like a held breath. What she meant, I would come to understand, was that no one in their right mind would pay full price for a place like this. I paid anyway. The price was obscene, barely more than a used car, and I told myself that desperation has a way of creating opportunity. My divorce had gutted my savings. The apartment in the city had become a coffin of memories. I needed walls that didn't remember her voice, floors that hadn't absorbed the echo of our arguments. This house, with its peeling white paint and overgrown yard, promised exactly that. A fresh start, wrapped in cheap square footage. The first wrong thing I noticed was small. The mailbox at the end of the driveway still had letters inside, advertisements, mostly, their ink faded to ghostly pastels by months of sun and rain. One envelope near the bottom bore a handwritten address. The paper had softened with moisture and time, the words bleeding into illegibility. I threw them all away without reading them. They weren't mine. They belonged to whoever had lived here before, the family that had, according to the realtor's vague explanation, relocated suddenly. I met my nearest neighbor on that first afternoon. She emerged from between the trees that separated our properties like something summoned, a woman somewhere past 70 with eyes the color of creek water and hands that never stopped moving, adjusting her collar, smoothing her apron, picking at invisible threads on her sleeves. She introduced herself with a nod rather than a name, and when I mentioned that I'd just bought the place, her restless fingers went still. She told me the family had left for a trip, just packed up one day and drove off. She said they never came back, and when she said it, her gaze drifted past me toward the house, settling on the second-floor windows with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pity, perhaps, or warning. I asked if she knew where they'd gone. She shook her head, already turning away. Her final words hung in the humid air like a scent. Some places keep what's left behind. The interior of the house confirmed what the exterior had promised. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed only by my footprints as I moved from room to room. The furniture remained, a couch with floral upholstery, a dining table with 4 chairs, a television so old it still had knobs. I found a calendar on the kitchen wall, frozen on a month 3 years past. Someone had circled a date in red marker, the 15th. No notation, no explanation, just a circle, emphatic and unexplained. The dishes were the first thing that truly unsettled me. They sat in the sink, crusted with the residue of a meal long since rotted and dried. 3 plates, 3 glasses. A pot on the stove held something that had once been soup, now a desiccated brown crust clinging to the metal. The smell had faded years ago, but my mind supplied it anyway. That sweet, sick odor of food left too long in summer heat. In the living room, I found toys scattered across a braided rug. A wooden train with faded red paint. Building blocks arranged in a pattern that might have been a house or might have been nothing. A stuffed rabbit, gray with dust, slumped against the leg of the couch as though placed there by careful hands and then abandoned. I gathered them into a cardboard box, my skin prickling with each touch. They felt heavier than they should have, weighted with the residue of play interrupted. Upstairs, the wrongness intensified. The master bedroom held clothes still folded on the bed, shirts, pants, a woman's dress laid out as if someone had been deciding what to pack. The closet stood open, hangers pushed aside, gaps in the row of garments suggesting items removed in haste. But the dresser drawers remained full. The bathroom still held toothbrushes in a ceramic cup, bristles splayed and brittle. The other bedrooms, 2 of them, doors standing open to the hallway, held more evidence of sudden departure. I didn't linger in those rooms. The smallness of the beds, the faded posters on the walls, the abandoned belongings scattered across every surface made my stomach turn in ways I couldn't explain. I closed those doors and told myself I'd deal with them later, clear them out, make the space my own. That first night I slept on the couch downstairs. The master bedroom felt wrong, and I wasn't ready to confront it. I lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me, the creak of old wood, the tick of pipes, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames. Normal sounds, explicable sounds. I repeated this to myself until I almost believed it. The voice came just after 3 in the morning. It was soft, so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A whisper that seemed to drift down the staircase like cold air, carrying words I couldn't quite parse. I lay rigid, my heart a fist pounding against my ribs, and strained to hear. The sound faded, replaced by silence so complete it felt deliberate. I didn't sleep again that night. The following days established a pattern. Daylight brought rationality. I cleaned, I scrubbed, I hauled bags of abandoned belongings to the curb, even though no garbage truck would come down this road. I told myself the house was just a house, the circumstances of its vacancy just an unfortunate mystery. The realtor had mentioned something about estate proceedings, legal complications, heirs who never materialized. It happened. People vanished from their lives all the time, but the nights refused to cooperate with my explanations. The whispers returned on the 3rd night, clearer now. I woke to the sound of murmuring from somewhere above me, a susurrus of voices too faint to understand but too persistent to ignore. I climbed the stairs with my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness, my free hand trailing along the wall for balance. The closed doors at the end of the hallway seemed to pulse with shadow, seemed to breathe in the unsteady light. I pressed my ear to the wood. The sound stopped immediately, as though whatever made it had been listening for my approach. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers, expectant, patient, aware. I returned to the couch and lay there until dawn, watching the ceiling, waiting for something I couldn't name. The distortions began subtly. I would enter a room and find objects moved, not dramatically, not in ways I could prove, but shifted. The wooden train I'd boxed up appeared on the kitchen counter. The stuffed rabbit materialized on the bottom step of the staircase, positioned as though descending. I told myself I'd move these things myself, that memory was fallible, that the stress of relocation and divorce had fragmented my attention. But the explanations rang hollow, even as I spoke them aloud into the empty rooms. The sensation of being watched grew impossible to ignore. It prickled at the back of my neck while I washed dishes, tightened my shoulders while I read in the evenings, sent me spinning toward doorways, certain I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision. The house had no mirrors. I'd noticed this early on, found it strange, filed it away. Now the absence felt intentional, as though something in this place didn't want to be seen or didn't want me to see myself. I began sleeping poorly, then barely at all. The whispers came every night now, always in the small hours, always from those closed rooms upstairs. I stopped investigating. I would lie on the couch and listen as the sounds waxed and waned, sometimes resolving into what almost sounded like words. Please, don't. Here. The fragments assembled themselves into pleas I refused to fully comprehend. On the 7th night, I heard the words clearly for the first time. The voice drifted down the staircase like smoke, weightless and pervasive, and it said, "Don't forget us here." I visited my neighbor the next morning. She was hanging laundry in her yard, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task done 10,000 times. I asked her about the family again, how many had lived there, when exactly they'd left, whether she'd seen the car drive away. Her hands paused on a clothespin. She told me there had been a father and a mother and others. She said they'd seemed happy enough, though she hadn't known them well. The father had worked in the city, commuted every day down that terrible road. The mother had gardened, planted tomatoes that still grew wild in the backyard, choked now with weeds. They'd left one morning in summer, she said, all of them together. She'd seen the car pull out of the driveway and head toward the main road. I asked if anyone had investigated, if anyone had looked for them. She resumed hanging laundry, her voice flat. The house sat empty, she said. The years passed. Eventually someone put it up for sale. That was all she knew. That was all anyone knew. I walked back to my property with her words circling my thoughts. All of them together. I tried to picture it. A family loading suitcases, climbing into a car, driving toward a vacation they'd never take. But the image kept splintering, kept fracturing against the evidence I'd found inside. The dishes, the clothes laid out, the toys positioned as though in the middle of play. People didn't leave like that, not for a trip, not voluntarily. The paranoia took root in the second week, growing tendrils through every moment of my waking hours. I began checking the locks obsessively, circling the house at dusk to peer into shadows, starting at sounds I couldn't identify. The whispers had become a nightly constant, but now I heard other things too. Footsteps in rooms I wasn't occupying, the creak of weight on floorboards overhead, the soft thump of something falling. Every time I investigated, I found nothing. Empty rooms, settled dust, silence that felt like held breath. I stopped opening those doors upstairs. I couldn't say why exactly. The dread had grown too heavy, too specific. I would stand in the hallway and feel certain, irrationally, impossibly certain, that something waited on the other side, something that wanted me to open the door, something that had been waiting for a very long time. My sleep collapsed entirely. I would doze for minutes at a time, jerking awake at phantom sounds, my body rigid with adrenaline. In the mornings, I found evidence of my own movements that I couldn't remember making. Dishes washed and stacked, furniture rearranged. Once I woke to find myself standing at the bottom of the staircase, my hand on the banister, my bare feet cold against the wood floor. I had no memory of getting up, no memory of walking across the room. I had been dreaming of voices, of small hands tugging at my sleeve, of pleas I couldn't understand. The line between sleeping and waking blurred. The line between memory and imagination dissolved. I began to question every perception, every sensation, every thought that surfaced in my fragmenting mind. Was I hearing whispers, or was I manufacturing them from the white noise of solitude? Were objects moving, or was I moving them myself and forgetting? Was the house haunted, or was I? I couldn't answer. I still can't. The final night began like all the others. I lay on the couch in darkness, listening to the house breathe around me, waiting for the whispers to start. They came at 3, as always, that soft murmuring from above, those half-formed words that slipped through my comprehension like water through fingers. But this time they grew louder. The voices rose in volume and intensity, layering over each other, becoming a chorus of desperate pleas that filled the house like floodwater. Don't forget us. Please don't forget us here. The words battered against my ears, against my mind, until I couldn't tell if I was hearing them, or thinking them, or screaming them myself. I climbed the stairs. I don't remember deciding to do it. My body moved without my consent, drawn upward by something stronger than fear. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the closed doors at its end pulsing with shadow. The voices grew clearer with each step. Not one voice, not two, but several, overlapping, begging in unison. My hand closed around the doorknob. The metal was cold, so cold it burned. I opened the door. The room beyond was empty. Moonlight fell through the window onto bare walls, bare floors, bare shelves stripped of every object I'd seen days before. No toys, no furniture, no evidence that anyone had ever occupied this space. But in the dust on the floor, dust I knew I'd cleaned, dust I'd scrubbed away with my own hands, there were footprints, small ones, so many of them, circling the room endlessly, wearing paths into the gray film, overlapping and crisscrossing in patterns that made no sense. And on the wall, written in what looked like finger-drawn lines through the dust, were words I will never forget. "We are still here. You promised you wouldn't leave." I backed out of the room. I closed the door. I walked down the stairs and out of the house and sat in my car until morning, shaking, watching the windows for movement I never saw. I'm writing this from a motel room 30 miles away. I haven't been back to the house in 4 days. I tell myself I'll return eventually, to collect my things, to put it up for sale, to close this chapter of my life. But every time I think about that door, about those footprints in dust that shouldn't have been there, about that message addressed to someone who wasn't me, my hands start trembling and my vision blurs at the edges. The realtor calls every day. She wants to know if I'm satisfied with my purchase. She wants to know if there's anything she can help with. I don't answer. I've started hearing whispers here too. Faint, almost inaudible. Probably just the ventilation system, the hum of the ice machine outside my door, the murmur of televisions through thin walls, probably just my mind manufacturing sounds from silence, still trapped in patterns established during those sleepless nights. Probably. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the words clearly. And I wonder if the family ever really left that house at all. I wonder if something in that place collects what stays behind. Not bodies, but something else. Something that lingers. Something that waits. I wonder if I left something behind too. I wonder if it's calling me back. Story 4. The photographs lied. I understood this within seconds of stepping out of my car, gravel crunching beneath boots I'd bought specifically for this new chapter of my life. In the listing, the cabin had glowed with honeyed light, windows like warm eyes beckoning travelers home. But standing here now, watching the afternoon sun strain to illuminate the weathered wooden walls, everything seemed dimmer, as if someone had adjusted the saturation of reality itself, draining it to something pale and unconvincing. The mountain air carried a chill that the late September forecast hadn't mentioned. I pulled my jacket tighter and approached the gate, where a hand-painted sign announced the property's name, Mountain's Rest. The letters were fresh, a cheerful forest green against cream-colored wood. But something about the sign's texture caught my attention, a slight unevenness, a topography of history beneath the new paint. I ran my thumb across the surface and felt the ridges of previous incarnations, names buried under names, identities shed like snakeskin. The owner had explained during our brief phone call that he'd like to refresh the property between tenants. A new coat of paint here, updated fixtures there, a new name to mark new beginnings. I'd found it charming then, evidence of care and attention. Now standing before this layered sign, I felt something else entirely. Something I couldn't name but that settled into my stomach like a stone dropped into still water. The first week passed in the mechanical blur of unpacking and adjustment. The cabin was small but sufficient. A main room that served as living space and kitchen, a bedroom barely large enough for the mattress I'd brought, and a bathroom with plumbing that groaned like something ancient being roused from sleep. Every surface carried a faint chemical smell, fresh paint, new sealant, industrial cleaner, attempting to mask something older and more organic underneath. I told myself the shadows were normal. Mountain cabins have shadows. The sun sets earlier here, blocked by peaks that seemed to lean closer each evening. The way light pooled in corners and left others perpetually dim was simply architecture, not intention, but I couldn't explain why certain shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, or why the bedroom always felt 3 degrees colder than the rest of the cabin, regardless of how I adjusted the ancient heating system. or why on my fourth night, I woke at 3:47 a.m. to the absolute certainty that someone was standing in the corner of the room watching. There was no one there. Of course there was no one there. I checked every room, every closet, even stepped outside to scan the tree line with my phone's flashlight. Nothing but pine and darkness and my own ragged breathing forming clouds in the cold air. Sleep didn't return that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee I'd made too strong, and noticed for the first time the marks on the wooden floor near the bedroom door. Scratches. Dozens of them, running in parallel lines as if something, or someone, had been dragged. The fresh polyurethane coating had filled them in, made them smooth to the touch. But the overhead light caught their edges and illuminated a history I hadn't been meant to see. My nearest neighbor lived half a mile down the mountain road, in a house that seemed to grow organically from the hillside. He was an older man, weathered in the way people become when they've spent decades arguing with difficult soil and harsher winters. I met him during my second week, when I'd walked too far in unfamiliar terrain and found myself uncertain of which trail led home. He studied me with pale eyes that seemed to absorb more than they reflected. When I mentioned where I was staying, his expression shifted, just slightly, a tightening around the mouth that he quickly suppressed. The cabin had been empty for almost a year before I'd arrived, he told me. The previous tenant had left suddenly, in the middle of the night, abandoning most of his belongings. Before him, a woman had lasted 6 months. Before her, a couple who'd stayed only 3 weeks before breaking their lease and disappearing down the mountain. He recited these facts in the flat tone of someone describing weather patterns, inevitable and beyond question. I asked if he knew why people left. He looked past me, toward the direction of my cabin, though it was invisible through the trees. Some places, he said, don't want to be lived in. Then he gave me directions home and retreated inside without saying goodbye. That night I found myself scraping at the gate sign with my car key. Layer by layer I revealed the cabin's previous names. Serenity, Fresh Start, New Dawn, all the optimistic nomenclature of escape, of second chances. And beneath them all, in letters that seemed somehow darker than simple paint, the original name emerged. Last Chance. My hand was shaking, though I couldn't remember when it had started. The sounds began during week 3, subtle at first, creaking that could have been settling wood, whispers that might have been wind finding gaps in old window frames. But they organized themselves gradually, taking on patterns and rhythms that seemed almost deliberate. Footsteps in the attic space I'd assumed was too shallow for anyone to occupy. Breathing that seemed to come from inside the walls. And once, in the gray light before dawn, what sounded unmistakably like my own name, spoken in a voice I almost recognized. I stopped sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch. Food lost its appeal, its texture and taste becoming somehow distant, as if I were experiencing it through layers of gauze. My reflection in the bathroom mirror developed shadows under its eyes that seemed deeper each morning, and occasionally, just occasionally, it seemed to move half a second after I did, playing catch-up with reality. The landlord didn't answer my calls. I left voicemails describing the sounds, the temperature fluctuations, the persistent feeling of being observed. No response came. When I drove to the address listed on my lease, a property management office in the nearest town, I found an empty storefront with sun-bleached paper covering the windows. The neighboring business owner told me the office had been vacant for years, decades maybe. She looked at me strangely when I showed her the lease with its official letterhead and signatures. I began documenting everything. Photographs of the scratched floors, the layered sign, the shadows that seemed to occupy spaces they shouldn't. Videos of the sounds, though they never seemed to record properly, always just beneath audibility, lost in static and ambient noise. I filled a notebook with timestamps and observations, my handwriting degrading page by page into something cramped and frantic. Reading through these notes now, I can see where I started referring to the cabin as if it were conscious, where I began capitalizing it in certain passages, where I stopped distinguishing between what I'd seen and what I might have dreamed. The breakthrough, or breakdown, depending on perspective, came on a Tuesday night during my 6th week. I'd been awake for 40 hours, sustained by coffee and the particular electricity of profound unease, when I noticed the wall behind my bed had developed a new stain. Number not developed. Revealed. The fresh paint was bubbling slightly, moisture from somewhere seeping through, and beneath the peeling surface I could see markings. Not random water damage. Words. I spent hours carefully peeling back the paint, using a butter knife and fingernails and eventually my bare hands when precision stopped mattering. Layer after layer came away, revealing messages from previous tenants written directly on the wood, dates and names and fragments of thought, a palimpsest of desperation. It watches from the corner. Can't sleep. It knows when I sleep. Day 23. Still here. Still waiting. Don't trust the... This one was incomplete. The final word obscured by what looked like a burn mark. It just wants company. And finally, in handwriting, I recognized with sick certainty as my own, though I had no memory of writing it. I never left. My hands were raw and bleeding. The cabin had gone completely silent. No creaking, no whispers, no sounds at all except my own ragged breathing. Even the wind outside had stopped, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I ran to the bedroom door and found it locked from the outside. I'm still here. I don't know how many days have passed since that night. Time has become unreliable, measured only by periods of light and dark that seem to stretch and compress according to their own logic. The door unlocked eventually, or perhaps I only imagined it had been locked in the first place. The messages on the wall were gone when I looked again, covered by paint that showed no evidence of being disturbed. My car won't start. The engine turns over but never catches, as if something essential has been removed. My phone shows full signal but calls never connect, texts never send, and the internet delivers only cached versions of pages I visited weeks ago. The neighbor hasn't been outside when I've walked past his house. The curtains are always drawn. Once I thought I saw him watching from an upstairs window, but when I raised my hand to wave, the figure withdrew into darkness. I've started talking to the cabin. This seems reasonable now, in a way it wouldn't have seemed reasonable before. If it can watch, if it can want, perhaps it can understand. Perhaps that's what it's waiting for. Not victims, but companions. Not prey, but guests who finally acknowledge their host. I found a new name buried under the layers on the gate sign, beneath even last chance. I don't know how I missed it before. The letters are faded almost to invisibility, but in the right light, at the right angle, they resolve into something that might be a word. Home. Or perhaps that's only what I want to see. The paint has become difficult to read, the layers bleeding into each other until no single truth remains. Only interpretations. Only possibilities. The sounds have stopped. The shadows stay where they belong. The temperature has normalized, and my reflection moves precisely when I do, not before, not after. These improvements should comfort me, but instead they feel like the silence between lightning and thunder, a held breath before something inevitable arrives. I've stopped trying to leave. The mountain roads confuse me now, every turn leading back to the cabin, every trail depositing me at the gate with its layered sign. Perhaps I've forgotten how to navigate terrain I once understood. Perhaps the geography has rearranged itself while I wasn't paying attention. Perhaps there never was a road out. At night, when the darkness presses against the windows with almost physical weight, I lie awake and listen to the breathing inside the walls. It sounds like my own. It might be my own. The distinction has lost meaning. Tomorrow, I'll repaint the sign. A fresh name for a fresh start. That's what tenants do here, I think. They rename and repaint and convince themselves they're in control, that they're staying by choice, that the door will open whenever they want to walk through it. The owner will understand. The owner always understands. I just need to remember who the owner is. Story 5. The lease was cheap enough to make me suspicious, but desperation has a way of silencing doubt. $300 a month for a studio in the heart of the city. The kind of deal that doesn't exist unless something is profoundly wrong. I signed the papers without asking questions, ignoring the water stains on the ceiling, the faint smell of something organic trapped beneath layers of cheap paint, the way the afternoon light seemed to die the moment it crossed the threshold. The doorman was a heavy-set man with nicotine-stained fingers and a laugh that sounded like gravel scraping against glass. When I told him which unit I'd rented, he paused mid-cigarette, smoke curling around his weathered face like a shroud. He said something about nobody lasting more than 2 nights there, chuckling as if sharing an inside joke I wasn't privy to. I asked him what he meant, but he just shrugged, stubbed out his cigarette against the brick wall, and told me to have a good stay. The way he emphasized good made my skin prickle. The studio itself was unremarkable in its decay. 1,200 square feet of warped hardwood floors, a kitchenette with appliances that hummed in frequencies that felt wrong, and a single window overlooking the alley where the neighboring building's air conditioning units dripped a constant rhythm onto the fire escape below. The bed came with the unit, a queen-sized mattress wrapped in plastic that crinkled when I sat on it, releasing a faint odor of disinfectant and something else, something sweeter, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. The first night passed without incident. I unpacked my single suitcase, arranged my toiletries in the bathroom cabinet with the cracked mirror, and fell asleep to the distant sound of traffic and the irregular dripping from the alley. My dreams were formless, gray, the kind of sleep that feels more like a temporary absence than actual rest. When I woke, pale morning light filtered through the grimy window, and I felt nothing more than the mild disorientation of sleeping in an unfamiliar place. I spent the day exploring the neighborhood, finding a coffee shop 3 blocks away where the barista had tired eyes and a mechanical smile, a laundromat that smelled of industrial soap and loneliness, a convenience store where the fluorescent lights buzzed with the insistence of trapped insects. When I returned to the studio that evening, I noticed for the first time how the hallway lights flickered in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, as if something was testing them, learning their rhythm. The second night began like the first. I showered in water that ran lukewarm at best, the pressure inconsistent, sputtering and gasping through pipes that groaned within the walls, like the building itself was digesting something. I dried myself with a towel that never quite lost its dampness no matter how long I left it hanging, dressed in worn sweatpants and a t-shirt soft from years of washing, and climbed into the plastic-wrapped bed. The mattress crinkled beneath me, a sound like whispered secrets, and I pulled the thin blanket up to my chin despite the room's oppressive warmth. Sleep came slowly, reluctantly, like an animal approaching an outstretched hand with suspicion. I don't know what time it was when I first noticed it. The room was dark save for the orange glow of streetlights bleeding through the window, casting long shadows across the ceiling that moved with the passing of cars below. I lay on my back, staring at those shadows, feeling the heaviness of near sleep pressing down on my chest, when I became aware of a sound, breathing, not my own. I held my breath to be certain, and still it continued, a soft, wet sound, like air being drawn through a constricted throat, coming from somewhere beside the bed. Close. Too close. I could feel the faintest disturbance in the air, a warmth that didn't belong, brushing against my exposed forearm like the exhalation of something alive. My heart began to pound, a violent percussion against my ribs that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I told myself it was the pipes, the building settling, the echo of my own pulse reverberating through the cheap mattress. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe slowly, to count backward from 100, to anchor myself in rationality. The breathing accelerated. It matched my heart rate, beat for beat, breath for breath, as if whatever was making that sound could sense my fear, could taste it in the stale air between us. I squeezed my eyes tighter, and the breathing grew faster still, more urgent, more desperate, the wet rasp of it filling my ears until I could hear nothing else. I opened my eyes. The breathing stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to look toward the side of the bed where the sound had originated. The shadows on the ceiling continued their silent dance, indifferent to my terror. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I slipped into a sleep plagued by dreams of drowning in black water while something circled beneath me, never touching, only watching. The third morning arrived gray and heavy, the sky outside the window the color of old bruises. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the building around me, the distant clang of pipes, the muffled footsteps of neighbors I never saw, the persistent dripping from the alley below. I tried to convince myself that what I'd heard was a dream, a hypnagogic hallucination born from stress and unfamiliarity. People hear things when they're falling asleep. It's documented, scientific, normal. I didn't believe myself. I spent the day outside the studio, unable to bear the thought of being within those walls while daylight lasted. I walked until my feet ached, sat in the coffee shop until the barista's mechanical smile began to falter with each refill, wandered through a park where the trees stood bare and skeletal against the overcast sky. When evening came, I stood outside my building for nearly 30 minutes, watching the windows of my floor, half expecting to see something looking back. There was nothing, just glass, reflecting the dying light. The doorman wasn't at his post when I entered. The lobby was empty, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly pallor that made my skin look jaundiced. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight, counting the flights like a condemned man counting the days until execution. The door to my studio looked the same as when I'd left it. The same peeling paint, the same tarnished brass numbers, the same faint smell of mildew seeping through the cracks. But when I inserted my key and turned it, I felt a resistance that hadn't been there before, as if something on the other side was pressing against the door, leaning its weight into the frame. The door opened to an empty room. I entered slowly, scanning the shadows, checking the corners, the bathroom, the closet that was too shallow to hide anything larger than a coat. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My toiletries in the cabinet, my suitcase against the wall, the bed with its plastic-wrapped mattress, sheets twisted from my restless sleep the night before. But the air felt different, heavier, charged with an expectation I couldn't name. I didn't want to sleep. I sat in the single chair by the window, watching the alley below, watching the shadows lengthen and merge as night consumed the city. I turned on every light in the studio, banishing the darkness to the corners where it pooled like oil, waiting. I drank coffee from the pot I'd bought at the convenience store, bitter and burnt, until my hands trembled and my thoughts raced in circles that led nowhere. Eventually, inevitably, my body betrayed me. My eyes grew heavy despite the caffeine, my muscles slack with exhaustion. I told myself I would just rest my eyes for a moment, just close them for a second, just. The breathing began immediately, closer this time, not beside the bed but beside me, beside the chair, so close I could feel the heat of it against my cheek. My eyes flew open, and I saw nothing. The room was empty. The lights still blazed, the shadows still cowered in their corners. But the breathing continued, wet and ragged and hungry, coming from a space that should have been empty. That was empty, that I could see was empty. I stood so quickly the chair toppled backward, crashing against the hardwood floor with a sound that echoed through the studio like a gunshot. The breathing stopped. I spun in a slow circle, searching for the source, finding only air and light in the distant hum of the refrigerator. My hands were shaking. My breath came in short, sharp gasps that fogged in the air before me. The room had grown cold, impossibly cold, despite the radiator clanking steadily in the corner. I could see my exhale crystallizing in the light, white plumes that dissipated into nothingness. And then I noticed the second plume. Beside me, perhaps 2 feet away, where nothing stood, where nothing could stand. A column of fog formed with each wet breath I could still hear but no longer wanted to acknowledge. I watched, paralyzed as the fog appeared and disappeared in a rhythm that had nothing to do with my own lungs. Each exhalation hanging in the frozen air like proof of something impossible. Something that was there, that was right there, that I could not see but could not deny. I ran. I don't remember leaving the studio, don't remember descending the stairs, don't remember bursting through the lobby doors into the cold night air. I found myself on the sidewalk, gasping, my bare feet numb against the concrete, wearing only my sweatpants and thin t-shirt. I stood there for a long time, staring up at the window of my studio, watching for movement, for a shape, for anything that might confirm I wasn't losing my mind. The window remained dark. I'd turned off the lights. I knew I had turned on every light. I knew this with the certainty of someone who had done it deliberately, obsessively, checking each switch twice. But the window was dark now, a black rectangle against the building's facade. And as I watched, I saw something press against the glass from the inside. Not a hand, not a face, just pressure, a distortion in the glass, as if something was leaning against it, looking down at me, watching. The doorman found me the next morning, still standing on the sidewalk, shivering in the gray dawn light. He didn't seem surprised. He asked if I'd made it to 3 nights, and when I didn't answer, he nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. He said the last tenant had made it to 4, but she'd stopped speaking after that. Spent 2 weeks in the hospital before she could tell anyone what happened. She never did tell anyone. She still can't. I asked him what was in that room. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and told me that nothing was in the room. That was the problem. Nothing was in the room, and nothing was very, very hungry. I left that morning, packed my single suitcase with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, walked out without looking back, without canceling the lease, without asking for my deposit. I'm writing this from a motel room 30 miles outside the city, a room with thin walls and stained carpet and a door that locks from the inside with a chain I've checked 17 times. It's almost midnight now. I've left all the lights on. I've stuffed towels under the door. I've convinced myself, almost, that whatever was in that studio stays in that studio, that it's bound to those walls, that it can't follow. But I can hear it now, that wet, ragged breathing, just beside the bed, just out of sight. Accelerating, always accelerating, every time I close my eyes. And I'm no longer certain of anything, whether the sound is coming from outside me or from within, whether I left the studio or brought something with me, whether the thing that breathes in the darkness has always been here, patient and hungry, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to listen, waiting for me to finally understand that the space beside me has never, not once in my entire life, been as empty as I believed. I won't sleep tonight. I'm afraid of what I might hear if I do. I'm more afraid of what I might see if I open my eyes. Story 6. The landlord's handshake was damp. I remember that detail now, though at the time I attributed it to the August heat, to nerves, to anything reasonable. He was an older man with eyes that never quite settled on my face, always drifting past my shoulder as if tracking something behind me. When he mentioned the house's history, his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and I had to lean closer to hear him say that the previous tenants had experienced strange problems. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. The rent was half what I'd been paying for my cramped apartment downtown, and I was desperate enough to let vague warnings dissolve into the excitement of finally having space, silence, a place entirely my own. The first week passed without incident. The house was old but solid, built sometime in the 1940s with thick plaster walls that muffled the outside world into a distant hum. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and settled into the particular rhythm of solitary living. My wife had left 8 months earlier, not dramatically, not with screaming or slammed doors, but with a quiet resignation that felt worse. She'd said I was becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone who stared too long at shadows and flinched at sounds only I could hear. I told myself the new house would be a fresh start, a chance to prove to myself that I was still the rational man I'd always believed myself to be. It was on the 9th day that I found the first puddle. I had just returned from work, the evening light casting long, amber rectangles across the hardwood floor, when I noticed it. A small pool of water near the living room window. Not clear water, but murky, carrying the faint brown tint of rust or old pipes. I crouched beside it, pressing my fingertips to the liquid. Cold, impossibly cold, as if it had been drawn from some deep underground place where sunlight never reached. I looked up at the ceiling, searching for signs of a leak, but the plaster was smooth and dry. The window was closed, sealed tight against the humidity outside. I cleaned it up with paper towels and told myself it was condensation, some quirk of the old house's ventilation system. But when I brought the towels to my nose, there was a smell, faint, organic, like standing water in a forgotten drain, like something that had been still for too long. 3 days later, another puddle appeared in the hallway outside my bedroom, then one in the kitchen, forming a nearly perfect circle on the linoleum. They always came when I wasn't looking, as if the house was waiting for my attention to drift before releasing its strange moisture. I started checking the floors obsessively, running my hands along the baseboards, feeling for dampness. My palms came away dry, yet an hour later, there it would be. Another small lake of that brackish water, always cold, always carrying that faint mineral stench. I called a plumber. He was a heavy-set man with kind eyes who spent 2 hours checking every pipe, every fitting, every conceivable source of water in the house. He found nothing. When I showed him where the puddles had appeared, he scratched his head and suggested I keep an eye on the humidity levels. He looked at me the way my wife used to look at me in those final months, with a mixture of concern and something uncomfortably close to pity. The bathroom became the epicenter of my unease. It was a small room, original to the house, with hexagonal floor tiles in faded white and a clawfoot tub that dominated the space. The mirror above the sink was old and slightly warped, creating subtle distortions in my reflection that I tried not to examine too closely. It was there that I first noticed the steam. I had just woken, stumbling into the bathroom with the grogginess of disrupted sleep, when I saw it, a fine mist clinging to the mirror's surface, droplets running in thin lines toward the sink. The shower was off. The hot water hadn't been touched since the previous evening. I pressed my hand to the glass and felt warmth, residual heat as if someone had just stepped out of a scalding bath. I stood there for a long moment, my reflection fractured through the condensation, watching the droplets trace their paths downward like tears. I wiped the mirror clean. I told myself it was nothing, but it kept happening. Every morning, sometimes in the middle of the night when I padded to the bathroom in darkness, the mirror would be fogged, the air thick with humidity that had no source. Once, I found a handprint in the steam, 5 fingers splayed wide, pressed against the glass from the inside. It was larger than my own hand. I know because I measured, holding my palm against the fading impression, watching my fingers fall short of those ghostly marks. I stopped sleeping well. The house seemed to breathe around me, settling into sounds that might have been wood contracting in the cool night air, or might have been footsteps in rooms I knew were empty. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant drip of water from somewhere I could never locate. In the morning, there would be wet footprints leading from the bathroom to my bedroom door, bare feet, larger than mine, stopping just at the threshold, as if whatever made them had stood there watching me sleep before retreating. I started keeping the bathroom door closed. I pushed a towel against the gap at the bottom, stuffed the keyhole with tissue. It didn't matter. The dampness found its way through, seeping under the door in thin rivulets that I would discover in the gray light of dawn, tracing patterns across the hallway floor that almost looked intentional, almost looked like words in a language I couldn't read. My colleague at work asked if I was feeling all right. I caught my reflection in the office window and saw someone I barely recognized. Hollow-eyed, skin pale and slightly damp with nervous sweat, hair uncombed. I told him I was fine. I told myself I was fine. But I had started avoiding mirrors entirely, unable to shake the feeling that my reflection moved a half-second too slow, that it blinked when I hadn't blinked, that it watched me with an expression I wasn't wearing. The neighbor came by once, an elderly woman who had lived on the street for decades. She brought cookies and asked how I was settling in. When I mentioned the water issues, her face changed. Something flickered behind her eyes, a recognition she quickly suppressed. She told me the house had been empty for 3 years before I moved in. She told me the family before me had left in the middle of the night, taking nothing, leaving furniture and photographs behind as if fleeing from something that couldn't be outrun. She didn't know what had happened to them. No one did. They simply vanished, she said, like water down a drain. After she left, I found a puddle on the front porch, directly where she had been standing. I began to research the house's history. The local library had archives, newspaper clippings, fragments of the past preserved in yellowing paper. I found references to the property dating back to its construction, mentions of owners who had come and gone with unusual frequency. But it was an article from 1987 that stopped my breath. A brief mention of a man who had lived alone in the house, who had complained to neighbors of water appearing from nowhere, of steam in empty rooms, of the feeling that he was sharing his home with something he couldn't see. The article didn't say what happened to him. It simply noted that the house had been sold at auction the following year, his belongings left unclaimed. That night, I dreamed of drowning. I was in the bathtub, my bathtub, the clawfoot one with the rust stains around the drain. But the water was black and cold and rising. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only watch as the water climbed past my chest, my neck, my chin. Just before it closed over my face, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the tub, looking down at me with features I couldn't quite make out. It reached toward me with a hand that dripped darkness, and I woke gasping, tangled in sheets that were soaked through with sweat, or something that looked like sweat, but carried that same mineral smell, that same impossible cold. I turned on every light in the house. I sat in the living room until dawn, watching the shadows, listening to the drip, drip, drip that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When the sun finally rose, I went to the bathroom. The mirror was completely fogged, more heavily than ever before. Water pooled on the floor in a wide crescent, as if someone had stepped out of the tub and stood dripping before the sink. And there, in the steam on the mirror, words had been traced by an unseen finger. "You are never alone." I stared at those words until the heat faded and they disappeared, until the mirror was just a mirror again, and I was just a man standing in a bathroom that smelled of deep water and old drains. I reached out and touched the glass. It was warm. It was always warm now, even when the rest of the house was cold. I should leave. I know I should leave. Every rational part of my mind screams at me to pack a bag and walk out the door and never look back. But there's another part of me, a part that has grown louder in recent days, that wonders if leaving would make any difference. The water found me here. What's to say it won't find me anywhere? Last night I woke to the sound of the bathtub filling. I lay perfectly still, listening to the rush of water, the pipes groaning in the walls, the slow gurgle of liquid finding its level. I didn't get up to check. I didn't want to see what might be waiting in that water, what might be watching me with eyes adapted to darkness, with patience measured in decades. This morning the tub was empty, but the floor was wet, and there were footprints leading from the bathroom, through the hallway, into my bedroom. They stopped at the side of my bed. When I measured them against my own feet, they were larger. They were always larger. I am writing this in the kitchen, where the afternoon light is strongest, where I can almost convince myself that I am safe, that I am sane, that the puddle forming slowly in the corner of my vision is just condensation, just a quirk of old plumbing, just anything other than what I fear it might be. My hands are shaking. There is water under my fingernails that I don't remember touching. When I look in the window's reflection, I see myself, but also, just for a moment, a shape standing behind me, dripping, waiting. I don't know what wants me. I don't know if anything wants me at all, or if this is simply what happens when a mind stretched too thin begins to tear. My wife was right. I was becoming someone else. Maybe I've been becoming someone else for a long time, changing so slowly that I didn't notice until I was already gone. The landlord's handshake was damp. I understand now that he was trying to warn me, in his way. Some houses hold on to things. Some houses remember. And some houses have been waiting so long for someone to fill their empty rooms that they will never, ever let go. There is water on the floor again, It is spreading toward my feet. It is cold, so cold, and I am no longer certain that I am the one writing these words, or if I am simply the hand that something else is using to speak. The mirror in the hallway is fogging over. I can hear the bathtub filling. I should go check. I should go see what's waiting for me in that dark water, what has been waiting all along in this house that breathes and drips and remembers. But I already know. I think I've always known. The water was here first. The water will be here last. And I am learning, slowly, what it means to drown on dry land. Story 7. The mailbox was overflowing when I arrived with the last of my boxes. Not with junk mail or advertisements, but with letters. Dozens of them, yellowed and swollen from humidity, crammed so tightly into the narrow metal slot that the lid had bent upward like a broken jaw. Strange, I thought, that neither I nor my wife had noticed them during the 3 visits we'd made before closing. Stranger still that the real estate agent hadn't bothered to clear them out. But I was tired. The August heat pressed down on my shoulders like wet wool, and the cicadas screamed their endless static from the oak trees lining the driveway. I grabbed the bundle of envelopes without looking at them and carried everything inside.